This is the Far Middle Podcast. Welcome. We're coming down the home stretch of January, and during this week, back in 1848, there was a gentleman by the name of James Marshall who discovered gold on the property of a Johann Suter in California. And later in 1848, President Polk endorsed the discovery. That led to a rush, so to speak, of 100,000 prospectors making their way to California the following year, which of course was 1849. So the California gold rush was off and running, and all those rushing to the state in 1849, they got dubbed, of course, as being 49ers. So this is the week where a discovery catalyzed the development of what would become the largest state in the nation by population, and the week that also ended up naming a professional football team in San Francisco. I am your host, Nick Diolius. You can follow me on Twitter at Nick Diolius. I encourage you to do so. I'm always posting tweets when I'm trying to get you thinking each day. And our sports dedication for episode 88 is going to go to one of the most interesting individuals that I can think of who achieved greatness as a professional athlete, but then also repeated the achievement of greatness in a non-athletic endeavor or career. So his story, it's an amazing one, and it's a story that just oozes excellence throughout every chapter of his life. We dedicate episode 88 to Alan Page, the Minnesota Vikings football great. So much to like and admire about Alan Page. First, he hailed from northern Appalachia, not far from where I'm sitting in Canton, Ohio. And yeah, that's the same Canton, Ohio that is home to the Pro Football Hall of Fame, where Alan Page ended up with his bust in after he retired from the NFL. And here's an even more uncanny fact about Alan Page in the Hall of Fame. When he was in high school, he took a job working on a construction crew in Canton that had a project of building the Hall of Fame building. So think about it. You had an individual that was born and raised in the same town that the Hall of Fame is in. He worked on a construction crew that had built the Hall of Fame building. And then when his football playing days are over, years down the road, he ends up being enshrined in the very same building as a member of the Pro Football Hall of Fame itself. That's a story that's almost too good to be true, but true it is. Now, Page graduates from Central Catholic High School in Canton, and he is off to Notre Dame. He excels at Notre Dame, becoming a consensus All-American and helping the Fighting Irish win a national championship in 1966 when Page is a senior. He gets drafted in the first round by the Minnesota Vikings in 67, and he played for the Vikings for 11 seasons. He was the anchor and foundation of the famous Purple People Eaters defense. And now the Purple People Eaters defense of the Vikings, it's one of the greatest defenses in the history of the NFL. And you can see where I rank them on my list of the 10 greatest Super Bowl era NFL defenses on nickdiolius.com. You can find that ranking under the main menu of the website. Just click on topics, then commentary in the sub-menu, and then sports, and you will find that top 10 ranking. Page was dominating on the defensive line, 9 consecutive Pro Bowls. In 1971, he wasn't just the Defensive Player of the Year in the NFL, he was also the NFL's most valuable player. Page was the first defensive player to earn MVP honors, and I think he's been the only player to do that in addition to one other since then, and the other person is a guy by the name of Lawrence Taylor. But Page wasn't content with just being a great football player. While he was still playing, he attended the University of Minnesota Law School and then became a lawyer in the offseason. In the early 90s, Page was elected to become an associate justice on the Minnesota Supreme Court, and he was the first African American to serve in that position. He held that position on the Minnesota Supreme Court until he hit the mandatory retirement age of 70. Alan Page and his wife, they founded the Page Foundation. It's done all kinds of amazing work throughout various communities and initiatives. And just to cap off the most well-rounded of well-rounded lives, Alan Page, when he was still playing with the Vikings, he found the time to become a competitive long-distance runner, and he's competed in numerous marathons. So you got a student, you got an athlete, you got a Hall of Famer, you got a judge, and you got a philanthropist. Sounds like the ingredients of a great American to me. Episode 88 is dedicated to Alan Page. That dedication should serve as a great motivator to get us fired up and off and running with making connections. So Alan Page, he's a prominent Catholic, and most prominent Catholics, of course, are looking toward the Pope, who runs the church from the headquarters of the Vatican in Rome, for some guidance and for leadership. And the current Pope, as we've discussed on a number of episodes of the Far Middle, has delved from time to time into issues and policies far afield from traditional arenas dealing with faith and morals that popes historically have subject matter expertise and authority over. And the current pope, he loves to dive headfirst into various topics that he and the Catholic Church lack expertise in, everything ranging from climate change to capitalism to energy policy. Well, the Vatican is at it again. Recently, the Vatican called on Catholics and Catholic institutions all over the world to avoid investing money in entities or companies that are in industries that the Church views as immoral. And the specific term that the Vatican used, I believe, was making faith-consistent investments. So, what the Church is now trying to do is direct investments in accordance with what it says are Catholic teachings. And there's two sides to this coin. The first side is encouraging Catholics to invest their money into, again, using their term, proactive, positive investing. Now, these are the favored industries, at least as far as the Vatican subjectively deems them to be. And not surprisingly, so-called renewable energy like wind and solar, they fit the bill, as well as things like microfinance, which is a bit of an opaque concept and has been tough to objectively track when it comes to efficacy and performance. Now, the flip side of the coin is where the Vatican is passing judgment over all kinds of industries that it will deem to be inappropriate for an investment. The industries tagged with the inappropriate label include drug companies that are used in executions by lethal injection, companies conducting animal experiments in the production of consumer goods, defense contractors, agriculture firms utilizing genetically modified seeds, and of course, the worst of all in the eyes of the current pope, fossil fuel companies. Now, I'm not going to weigh in on whether a drug company making drugs used in lethal injections during executions or the industry that will conduct animal experiments to refine consumer products, whether they are appropriate or inappropriate. I get that the Vatican would deem them inappropriate, and I also get why Catholics would defer to the Vatican on whether such industries or activities are inappropriate when compared to Catholic doctrine. But I'm going to weigh in on the Vatican's view that investment in renewable energy like wind and solar, that's positive and should be encouraged, while investment in things like natural gas or agriculture firms that use genetic science are inappropriate and should be discouraged. That is the exact opposite advice and moral conclusions that should be proffered and reached, respectively, and the reasons are scientifically clear and obvious. Encouraging investments in wind and solar technologies and deeming them positive and consistent with Catholic doctrine, that defies the reality. First, wind and solar as sources of power generation at scale, they produce tremendous carbon footprints that exceed the carbon footprints of power generation from sources such as natural gas, a fossil fuel, of course. So from a climate change perspective and an atmospheric CO2 perspective, wind and solar at scale, they do more harm than good versus natural gas-fired power generation. Another major moral problem with wind and solar is understanding where they come from and how they are manufactured. Mining the materials necessary for wind turbines and solar panels and electric vehicle batteries for that matter, it's extremely environmentally destructive and requires massive surface disturbance through surface mining. It creates massive scars across the face of the earth, and much of those scars are going to be damage done in the developing world and to poor communities. And then the labor practices utilized to mine and manufacture wind, solar, and EV products are far from moral and in many instances should be deemed outright criminal. It's not blood diamonds anymore as much as it is blood solar. Slave labor is utilized in regions where much of this activity occurs, namely China with its Muslim minority, and wage rates and working conditions, they are far from what the Vatican would deem as just or moral for areas and regions such as Africa, where much of the extraction of the metals and minerals and materials needed for the solar panels and the wind turbines and the EV batteries are occurring. Meanwhile, consider where the major sources and supplies of natural gas reside, specifically within the borders of the United States and its vast shale deposits. The environmental standards here are best in class, surface disturbances are minimal, wage rates are some of the highest in the world, and all of this activity occurs in a nation that enjoys religious freedom and individual rights for all. The type of place and the type of activity and the type of fuel source that when assessing it objectively, the Vatican should be encouraging to the highest extent possible. Then there is the issue of agriculture and using genetic science to improve crop yields and improve food security. If science can be used to feed more people and improve food security, That's not just a good thing for the Catholic Church, it's an inherently moral thing to do. Think of it this way. Without genetic science and agriculture, net, food security worsens, and net, additional people suffer malnutrition or starve. Deeming genetic science in the field of agriculture as immoral and inappropriate investment, that's a ridiculous position for an institution that considers itself a moral authority to take. It was interesting to hear the Vatican's logic on blacklisting genetically modified seeds. It justified doing so by saying, and I'm using their words here, environmental and health risks not yet precisely defined. That's the terminology they used, along with general concerns about food security. If the Vatican applied the same filters and logic to wind and solar power generation, it would have blacklisted those investment vehicles as inappropriate as well. But of course, the Vatican did the exact opposite, making renewable energy the recipient of a gold star moral investment rating. That is exactly why the Vatican and the Pope should stay out of the evaluation of investment criteria and the capital markets. If you cared first and foremost about the human condition, and more specifically, the condition and quality of life of Catholics across the globe, then what you would recommend as appropriate versus inappropriate would be clear from the get-go. Any appropriate column would be agricultural firms utilizing genetic science to improve crop yields and food security, along, of course, with natural gas production and power generation, particularly where the natural gas is manufactured in Western Republican democracies, such as the United States. What you would consider in the alternative as inappropriate, or at best as questionable, would be things like wind and solar and electric vehicle industries, where the supply chains are very murky, the carbon footprints are quite egregious, and the human rights violations are obvious, and the costs are excessive to the point where they erode the quality of life for the developing world and the working poor. Yet the Vatican has managed to come up with a set of recommendations that is the exact opposite that the science and the logic would dictate. It's unbelievable that an institution that exists to provide moral guidance can have its moral compass be so fundamentally broken. Yes, it is pretty sad when a religious institution that's charged with setting moral direction is adrift in a sea of distraction. And that's what's going on with the Vatican, and it also reminds me and takes me to the next connection or dot to connect to, which is our friends at the United Nations and all of their various initiatives and working groups and treatises and treaties and accords. Well, there was another accord that came out of the bureaucratic beast that is the United Nations. This happened in late 2022. So just a few weeks ago, 200 nations signed on to the accord, so this was no small undertaking. And by the way, China was one of those signatory nations as well. You don't always see them signing on to these types of things. So what was this an agreement about? Well, the signatory nations to this accord agreed to conserve 30% of their land, inland waterways, and coastal and ocean areas. There was also an agreement to limit the risk of pesticides. I haven't been able to delve into the details of the accord to see exactly what that means. I do have my concerns with the UN asking for limiting the risk of pesticides because pesticides do a lot of good to humanity. Anyway, like most of these accords and position statements posturing by the UN efforts, this deal is not legally binding. And since many of the 200 nation signatories are in the developing world, there's no clear indication of where the funding is going to come from for the individual nations to set aside 30% of its land masses and waterways for conservation. Now, on the topic of funding sources, you can be sure where the ask is going to be coming from to raise the money, particularly the money for the developing nations who signed on to this accord. That's right, the money's going to come from developed nations like the United States and nations in Western Europe. This is yet another move by the United Nations that is illogical, setting aside almost a third of the landmass and waterways for conservation across the planet. That's going to have some inevitable consequences to the human condition. Economic development is going to be stymied, which is going to hurt employment and personal incomes. Housing and shelter are going to become less abundant and less affordable, and tangible metrics that matter the most to human beings, and here I'm talking about life expectancies and infant mortality rates and educational proficiencies, they're going to take a net negative step backward. And the biggest losers with respect to these metrics and consequences will, of course, be the poor and the developing world, the very people and the specific demographic that the United Nations prides itself on worrying the most about and protecting. But you see, there's one thing that the United Nations cares more about and places in higher priority than the poor in the developing world, and that is its zealotry when being strict adherents to the religion of environmentalism and its loyal attendance to the Church of Climate. If an action is deemed to be good for the earth, then the consequences be damned when they pertain to the poor in the developing world. And you constant listeners know that when discussing these types of topics, I just love to quote one of the head bureaucrats. Sometimes what they say and how they opine on these types of accords, it speaks better than any commentary I could provide to help make my point. So here we go. The co-chair for the working group that negotiated the agreement language had a gem of a quote once the accord was reached. The co-chair said, quote, "It's going to be difficult, painful, and costly to get there," end quote. And I have to tell you, I'm in total agreement with that statement. It's going to be difficult to set aside almost a third of the Earth's landmass for conservation to where humans cannot utilize the space. It's going to be extremely painful to hundreds of millions and perhaps billions of human beings. The misery this move will create is immeasurable, and it will surely be costly, not just in the dollars or in the financial sense, but this co-chair is speaking to, but more importantly, it's going to be incredibly costly to quality of life for human beings the world over. This is yet another example of why it's both sad and true to say that the world would be much better off without the United Nations today than we are with it. What the United Nations is setting the stage for and what these types of accords are really designed to do brings us to our next connection to make and our next dot to jump to. That is the subject of using environmentalism and things like climate change to justify the transfer of wealth from the developed world to the developing world, or from one demographic to another demographic, or from one unfavored class to the favored class. You're seeing two main avenues to try to accomplish this through the religion of environmentalism and the zealotry that is often assigned to climate change policy. First, from the EU bureaucracy, we saw in 2022, during its self-inflicted energy crisis and during the catalyzed invasion of the Ukraine by Russia, that the continent's climate policies enabled a concept that was beginning to gain traction. The bureaucracy of the EU, like it is always prone to do, came up with a catchy and benign euphemism to label outright property appropriation. Now, the marketing label that they came up with was solidarity contributions, and the substance of the concept was to institute a windfall tax on fossil fuel companies and a revenue cap, ironically, on wind and solar. And the justification was Putin's war and the energy crisis itself. Again, this is extremely ironic because Putin and his warmongering, along with the European energy crisis, those things were created by the EU bureaucracy and its climate policies. But that's how government, and that's how the administrative state, that's how they operate. They create one policy under the ploy of saving the planet, which creates all kinds of foreseeable consequential problems, and then they use those problems that they created to then justify additional levels of state control. And until the bureaucracy or the administrator or the politician is held accountable, this process continues to spiral and become larger and larger to the point where either the entire economy and society break, or the state ends up controlling everything and eradicates the individual and private sector. Neither outcome, of course, are a good one. But there is a second avenue that you see developing for value appropriation through entities such as the United Nations. And that avenue is via reparations, where the Western and developed world pays for its sins to the developing world. This is where the money would come from to pay for developing nations that signed on to this United Nations Accord to set aside 30% of their land masses and waterways for conservation. You see, it's not about conservation or the planet at all. Instead, it's a simple and brazen money grab. But you need some form of justification to set the table for the concept of the reparation, some form of original sin, so to speak, some prior wrong that must be made right. And that sin and that wrong is the developed world bringing to bear the Industrial Revolution and energy security and quality of life. Crazy, isn't it? Because when you think through the logic and the facts, the developing world should be thanking profusely the developed world for the technology and the quality of life and the development that has ensued over the past 200 years. No matter what region you choose on this planet, and that can be from the richest zip codes in the United States to the most desperately poor corners of different continents, life of humans is in a better state because of things like pharmaceuticals and genetic science and agriculture and fossil fuels like natural gas and plastics and chemicals than it would have been without these. And yes, of course, there still remains abject poverty in far too many places. but accept two realities. First, things would be even worse if it were not for the industry and capitalism and innovation and development that we've seen. And second, the lowest risk and most secure path to improve the lives of individuals suffering in poverty today is more of these things that bring quality of life, not less of them. So the Vatican preaches less of the things that bring quality of life, and the United Nations sets up accords that will allow for less of the things that bring quality of life, and the forced value appropriation that reparations or solidarity contributions are designed to procure, they drain the funding for things that bring quality of life, then they are in the end all anti-human. And not only do they not deserve support, they should be exposed head-on as flawed and wrong-headed. All of these moves, all of them wrong moves, by the Vatican and the United Nations and the EU, they all sort of remind me of a villain British general in the BBC series Blackadder who famously said, "If nothing else works, a total pig-headed unwillingness to look facts in the face will see us through." Doesn't that approach just sort of sum up perfectly how the EU's doubled down on its energy and climate policies when they've created a war and an energy crisis from one end of the continent to the other? Doesn't it just completely frame how the Vatican's preachings have led to more misery for Catholics in just about every corner of the planet? And doesn't it just epitomize why the United Nations does substantial harm to the human condition when it places its religious zealotry for environmentalism ahead of the quality of life for the human being? Yeah, when what we do and what we propose and what we lecture fails and doesn't work, let's just double down and ignore the reality. We're going to bring episode 88 to a close. This episode airs on a week that includes the birthday of the late, great Eddie Van Halen. He is, in my opinion, the greatest guitarist in the history of the rock era. And by the way, you can read about my top 10 rankings of the greatest guitarists in rock once again on nickdelius.com under the main menu of topics, and then you click on commentary and then the submenu of music. You'll find it there. Eddie Van Halen, as I said, is at the top of that ranking, so I'll give you sort of that spoiler right now. But let me know what you think about the rest of the top 10 list. I've received a lot of comments on that ranking through the past year or so. Now, what are the best works of Eddie Van Halen on each Van Halen album? From a pure guitar perspective, so not overall song, but just the overall guitar work on an individual track. Well, if you're wondering, here they are. I'll give them to you. On Van Halen, the band's first effort, you have to go right with Eruption. That instrumental came out of nowhere, and it immediately set the tone for what the world was about to experience in the form of Eddie Van Halen and his guitar. On Van Halen 2, go with Light Up the Sky. Opening track, it's a great guitar intro in the song, and it's guitar heavy throughout the entire song. So Light Up the Sky is an excellent selection on Van Halen 2. Now, the third album from Van Halen is Women and Children First, and Everybody Wants Some is a song that embodies spectacular guitar, start to finish, and it doesn't get much better than that, and the solo within Everybody Wants Some, I think, is particularly awesome. Next up is Van Halen's darkest album, which is Fair Warning, and perhaps their best album ever. It's one of my favorites, if not my favorite. And this is really hard to choose the best guitar-driven song on this one. Two all-time guitar exemplars on this album, Unchained and Mean Street, but I've got to go with Mean Street. The intro to the song is Eddie doing, once again, what no one had ever heard before. And early on in the Fair Warning tour, he would turn his back to the audience when playing the intro to Mean Street so people wouldn't be able to copy his technique. Now, Dive Her Down, that album is up next. I think it's the most underrated Van Halen album. I like it quite a bit. I think there's especially good guitar stuff on Dive Her Down. My top pick is Little Guitars, both the intro and the song, but you can't go wrong with Hang 'em High or Intruder Pretty Woman. 1984, now that's an album noted for its keyboard work. That's when Eddie broke out the keyboards in a big way. But it had some great guitar moments, and I'm going to go with Panama on 1984. That song, by the way, is about nothing. The lyrics are completely random, but the guitar riff makes it an instant classic, so that's saying something. And then if we're just sticking to David Lee Roth albums for this episode of the Far Middle in honor of Eddie Van Halen's birthday, the last David Lee Roth album to come out was A Different Kind of Truth. Lots of these tracks on the album were throwaways from prior years and prior album efforts, but there is one on this album that has an outstanding piece of guitar work, and that is Out of Space. So give that one a listen if you get a chance. So those are the best sort of guitar-driven songs on each of the David Lee Roth-led Van Halen albums. Maybe next year around this time for Eddie's birthday, we will do the best tracks on the Sammy Hagar albums. I'll leave you with a quote from Eddie Van Halen. There are really three parts to the creative process. First, there is inspiration, then there is execution, and finally, there is the release. Till next week, rock on, constant listeners.